one of the really hard things is to see someone's limitations, especially when everything else we know about them suggests they're not limited. So take a penguin, for example. It's like, what do you mean a penguin can't fly? It's a bird. It's got wings. It's got feathers. And birds with wings and feathers fly. Yep. Except the penguin can't. It's just simply beyond their ability, and we could choose to get mad at that, or we can accept it.
Welcome to the Audacious Living Podcast, hosted by my man, Audley Stevenson, the Odd Man. He'll unpack wisdom and insights from a cross-section of top quality performers in business, media, sports, entertainment, and lifestyle to uncover key elements to help you live your best audacious life ever. So without further ado, here is the Odd Man.
Greetings and salutations, folks. Audley Stevenson here, back for another edition of the most audacious podcast you'll find on the internet. This is the Audacious Living Podcast, and I appreciate you for being here as we continue our ongoing goal of helping our listeners live their best audacious lives ever. As always, I encourage you to connect with us through our social media channels. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under the handle The Audacious Pod. And if you head over to YouTube, if you're watching on YouTube, then you know that you can tap that bell down below and you instantly subscribe to the channel. And that way you're connected to all great things audacious related. Now, the topic of conversation on this edition of the podcast is about conflict, or more specifically, how to create more healthy conflict in both our personal and professional lives, and less of the toxic stuff that nobody likes. Now, conflict is one of those things that you either love or you hate. And while most of us run from conflict altogether because of the way it makes us feel and the negative emotions that it creates and the feelings inside of us and all that icky stuff, conflict is completely normal and can be a good thing. For good ideas or any sort of true innovation to exist between individuals, you need to have healthy conflict, argument, and debate. And that, of course, comes through human interaction. Our thoughts need to be challenged and tested. We need to expand our thinking or the way of doing things to be better. And as long as this is done in a healthy, positive, respectful way, then there's nothing wrong with it at all. Gabe Karp is with me on this episode of the podcast, and we really dive into the topic of conflict and how to create more of the healthier version in our lives. As a former trial lawyer, Gabe knows a thing or two about that negative, toxic conflict, and he uses much of his past experiences to guide his work. He's a speaker and an author of the book, Don't Get Mad at Penguins, and Other Ways to Detox Conflict in Your Life and Business. And a big part of the book is centered around accepting others for where they are as a step towards that healthier conflict that I just talked about. Gabe and I will talk all about all that great stuff and so much more on this edition of the Audacious Living Podcast. Enjoy. Hey, Gabe, thanks for joining me here on the Audacious Living Podcast. It's a pleasure to have you, and thanks for making the time.
Yeah, and thank you for having me. It's great to be here. Great to be with you.
Awesome. And so we're going to talk about conflict, which I think for some people, the hairs in the back of the neck are going to stand right away because, some people like conflict, some people don't, and there's different reactions to it. So we're going to definitely talk about that, as well as your book. I love the title. So maybe let's jump to that, because it's a great title. Don't be angry at the penguins because they don't fly.
Yeah, don't get mad at penguins.
That's right.
Just a shameless plug here. Shameless plug, by the way.
Very nicely done.
Don't get. You like how I wove that in there? Don't get mad at penguins. It's don't get mad at penguins and other ways to detox the conflict in your life and business.
Got you.
But there's a chapter that says don't get mad at penguins because they can't fly. And people are like, well, what's that all about? Why? Who would get mad at penguins? They're such cute little animals.
That's right.
And really, I view it like this: like to preach about it, it's like between expectation and reality is a space filled with suffering and conflict. And the wider that space is, the greater our suffering is. So the penguin analogy is one of acceptance. And it's kind of simple. It's like we should just accept people for who they are with all of their limitations and not expect them to do things that they're not capable of doing, even though we may like really, really want them to.
Right.
And one of the really hard things is to see someone's limitations, especially when everything else we know about them suggests they're not limited. So take a penguin, for example. It's like, what do you mean a penguin can't fly? It's a bird. It's got wings. It's got feathers. And birds with wings and feathers fly. Yep. Except the penguin can't. It's just simply beyond their ability, and we could choose to get mad at that,
right? Or
we can accept it.
Accept it. And I think it's a great analogy because so two words even as you're describing it, the two words that jump out, obviously the acceptance, it's there, but being realistic as well too, being realistic about what we want from others and even for ourselves, and so I do like the way you frame that because it doesn't make sense being mad at a penguin because it can't do it.
Right. Yeah. And I think translating it to more human and more human scenarios, it could be something simple. Like maybe you have a friend who's just always late.
Right.
No matter how important it is to you that they be on time, and they're always late. Yet you continue to expect that on this next occasion, they won't be late, that they will be on time, or maybe even something that's personal for people. It's like sometimes maybe someone has a friend who just injects a little negativity, gives you a little personal jab every time you have some good news to share.
Right.
But you continue to hope that on this next time you got something good to celebrate, they'll enjoy the moment with you. And that's the expectation. But if we think about it, we know the reality is something different, because the reality is, if you do have one of those friends, they very well may not be capable of being happy for themselves, let alone you.
Right.
It's got nothing to do with you.
Right.
And like the next time they get annoyed when you have some good news to share, don't get mad. Don't take it personally. It's not his fault that he's not capable of being happy for you. It's simply beyond his ability.
So then let's take that into the realm of conflict, where you spend a lot of time talking, and your book is around that very same topic as well. Is apply that to the field within the conflict spectrum, because it starts now. The picture becomes more and more clearer as you keep that analogy in mind.
Yeah. So I mean, you had said it at the beginning. It's like we're going to talk about conflict because some people are like really. The hairs on the back of their neck stand up when they think about conflict. And the reason is that it's uncomfortable for a lot of people. A lot of times it's scary. And the common misconception that I find with people, and it doesn't matter if you're in a business, in the boardroom, or in the cafeteria or the bar or the parent-teacher conference, it's the conflicts. It's the same patterns of conflict over and over and over again, just plug in different facts.
Right.
And one thing that people, I think, get wrong is that conflict is a bad thing that should be avoided at all costs. When the reality is, anytime you look at your life, if you're going to live your best audacious life, the moments and events where you grow the most, where you learn, where you're successful, where you're happy, it's usually as a result of dealing with conflict and in the midst of conflict and managing through it. Growth doesn't happen when everything's all comfortable and nice and cozy.
That's right.
Right. Growth is when you're out of your comfort zone.
Yes.
There's usually conflict. Maybe you're dealing with someone who's a difficult personality, or maybe you're in a situation where you've got some difficult feedback to give to somebody
Yes.
that can probably help them to grow. And you say, well, I don't want to do that. I don't want to have that uncomfortable conversation.
Right.
But if you lean into it and you realize, you know what, I have information. Let's take a situation where you do have feedback for someone. Right. It's like, if I were in their position, I would want someone to tell me this. So I'm going to go ahead and tell them. And I think that avoiding that conflict out of a sense of compassion is ironic, because it's actually a really mean thing to do to another human being. Like, to know how you can help them and then withhold that information.
Right.
Like, if right before I came on this show, someone saw me and was talking to me, and I had like spinach in my teeth, I had food in my teeth, and they didn't tell me. And now I get like that'd be mean. That'd like let me go do that. Right. So, I think that's a way to like accept that conflict is a good thing and can improve the situation. Always, if you deal with healthy conflict, because there is toxic conflict. Yes. And toxic conflict is bad. And in the book, we go into detail about breaking down what the toxins are. Yes. How to identify them and how to detox the situation. Right. I'm rambling. I'm sorry.
No. You're doing fine, Gabe. You're on a roll. I love it. Interesting, because when we talk about, and let's go back to you made the point around, you had spinach in your teeth, and and the people didn't tell you, right? So interesting. Oftentimes, individuals hold back and don't tell because of fear of conflict, or they think what they think might happen. But the really interesting thing is they've got no evidence or proof is that it actually will happen, but they're still afraid anyways, right? So it's this fear of something that you have no idea if it's founded in something that is realistic or not.
Exactly. And part of it is that it's fear, like, well, I don't want to tell him he got food in his teeth because he'll be embarrassed. Well, you know what? That actually might be true. I might be embarrassed one-on-one, but that embarrassment I feel from that person calling it out to me is nothing compared to the embarrassment I'm going to feel when I look in the mirror an hour later and be like, oh my God, was I just on a podcast with food in my teeth? Right. So the idea that you shy away from it because it's scary, it feels uncomfortable. The things that, and part of it, by the way, like, it's kind of toxic out there. Social media, news cycle.
Oh, sure.
People don't want to offend. People don't want to say anything that's going to offend somebody.
Sure, yeah.
And that has caused a lot of us to just keep it to ourselves, keep our mouth shut, even when it's helpful information. So it's almost like this mix of like, well, out of compassion, I'm not going to call out this person's flaw or the fact you got food in his teeth. Right. But that's not compassion. That's mean. That's mean.
Yeah. And you're also sort of a little bit selfish, I say. I mean, that's a hard word to use, but I think it's a little bit selfish. You're only thinking about yourself and not how you can help someone else be better.
I think that's fair. I was in a meeting once, and someone said something that I didn't know this person that well. And he said something, and I kind of I don't know what I did, but I was very dismissive of him. I just kind of dismissed it, and we moved on. And as we're walking out, and what I had done, by the way, is I basically shut down this guy from talking. He didn't say a word for the rest of the meeting because I didn't realize that I was kind of a jerk. I was curt with him, and as we're walking out, there's a woman I know extremely well, and she shoots me a look like, and I knew that look. I knew what it went, and it weighed on me heavy. And I shot her a look back. I'm like, what did I do? And she gave me another look like, if you don't know what you did, then I'm even more disappointed in you. And then she talked to me, and she said, you shut that guy down in that meeting, and he probably had some good things to add, and he'll never add a good thing in a meeting that you're in with him again. And she's basically said, you screwed up.
Right.
And I thought, well, now what do I do? And the answer is simple: go fix it. And I went and talked to the guy, and I said, hey man, I'm sorry. Like I did this wrong to me. I wasn't thinking about you personally, like, and we actually had a great conversation. And in that conversation, I said, hey, next time, like, you see me do something like that, please call me out. You're not going to embarrass me. Sure enough, next meeting we're in, he was like all over me, but it was more sport than it was more fun.
He was
But
making
that's
up for
great.
lost. He was making up for lost ground, I guess.
That's right. He had to get to even. He had to get level the playing field.
I love it.
But I think that's a great example where kind of my misstep in a communication created conflict between us.
Right.
He dealt with it by avoiding it, which I don't blame him. That's a natural human thing. It's like, why do I want to talk to a guy who's gonna shut me down in a meeting? But now once I kind of embraced the conflict, I owned up to my responsibility in it. I gave him the permission to say, to call me out anytime that happened again. Then it was great. Now, anytime there's conflict, as in like I say something he disagrees with, he'll raise it. And he very well may come up with some better thing than I'm coming up with.
Right.
That's good conflict.
As you're talking about, I wonder if there's some value in maybe defining what conflict is. And I know I don't want to get too basic in that terms of definition, but I think it's important to understand because for some people, conflict means we're butting heads and yelling and we're back and forth. But in the example that you gave for the illustration, there was some conflict, but you weren't even totally aware of it because someone else had to point it out to you.
Right. Exactly. I mean, I think and there are lots of definitions of conflict, and please don't pull out a dictionary and
Sure.
correct me. But I'd say one definition of conflict is when two people have opposing viewpoints, goals, or needs.
Right.
And in that situation, that guy had a desire to voice an opinion and express something, and I did something that shut it down. But I think conflict runs the whole gamut of two people not communicating well in a meeting, to being in a relationship with somebody where maybe they're behaving in a way that is hurting you, and so that's conflict because you're getting hurt by it. So how do you deal with that? Some people just, well, maybe it'll just go away on its own. But so There's that conflict. Maybe there's a conflict of you've got a client in business and you screwed something up, you messed something up.
Right.
So how are you gonna deal with that conflict? There's lots of ways to deal with that. Somebody pulls right in front of you, cuts in front of you in the parking lot, and steals your parking space. That's conflict.
Right.
So it's anything where someone is has done something that's getting in your way of whatever it is you want to do, or you're getting in someone else's way.
Got you. No, and I think that nicely frames it because sometimes conflict is intentional, but other times it is not, where people are unaware. And again, using that illustration, you weren't aware fully of what you were doing to that other individual. And so, and if we sort of practice sort of that understanding, and we're probably jumping a little into sort of tools we can use to manage it, but if we practice things like understanding or listening or empathy, I think that can help us resolve, or maybe not make it go away, but at least help us manage it a bit better.
Yeah. And by the way, one of the other, I think you just touched on something that's important. One of the fears of conflict, or the thing that makes conflict feel really big, is that when you kind of analyze a problem maybe you have with another person, in any context, you're thinking, well, I don't see a path to like resolve it. Like, I don't think I'm going to be able to get that person to come to my way of viewing things, and there's no way they're going to get me to come to their way of viewing things. So that's just too difficult to deal with. And I think one thing that can cut against that and diffuse that a little bit is the notion that you don't have to resolve all the world's problems at once. It is possible to have a productive, positive conversation with somebody who disagrees with you.
Right.
And you can, and you can find common ground and work together if it's important to you. You know, I mean, there are certain relationships in our lives that it's really hard to just jettison them off. You know, if it's if it's a family member or your mother-in-law or your next door neighbor, you know. I remember growing up, my next door neighbor was not on speaking terms with their next door neighbor. So they were like, you know, on the other side. And it was all because their kids would play basketball in the driveway and the ball kept going over into the bushes of the other neighbor, and they would go, you know, and because they avoided dealing with the conflict, they just got to the point where they wouldn't even speak to each other.
Gotcha. Wow. Wow. As opposed to finding some way of just resolving it and amicable meeting point and move forward. Wow. Yeah. We see it all the time, right, Gabe? It's as much as, you know, that story that you shared about the neighbors example, it's one that we've seen a lot, and it's almost in some instances kind of accepted as a norm because it's so common, right? So
yeah. And I think, you know, as we think about it on an individual level, when conflict is viewed as a bad thing and is scary and is toxic, you know, people, you know, like, let's say you got to go to your job, you know, and you're in a work environment where there's a lot of that toxic conflict, you know, in those environments, people don't give 100% of their effort toward the job. They spend, because they necessarily have to spend a lot of their time being worried about, am I going to get fired? Right. Or someone will spend 20 minutes just thinking about, man, why did that guy when I was at the coffee machines say that or do that? And then like that made me mad. And then just literally someone is now sitting at their desk where they're supposed to be working on some issue for a client or a problem at work, and they're just thinking how mad they are at what some guy did at a coffee machine. Right. But in like cultures and organizational cultures where conflict is viewed as a positive thing, and is not only accepted but encouraged, and in fact even required. Like sometimes there are meetings where people say, all right, for the next 10 minutes of this meeting, we are all required to initiate conflict. If you see something bad in this company, you got to raise it. If you got an issue, get it off your chest. If you, you know, and that frees people up. And then people are like, then they're focused on, well, how can I do my job better? How can I make this thing for our client better? How can I make this process improve? How can I improve upon this process? Right. The energy goes there instead of getting mad at someone because of the coffee.
Got you. And I know in your book you talked about creating environments of healthy conflict, and it kind of sounds like that in the illustrations, or that's what that is, right?
Yeah, I mean, sure. And there in the book there are lots of examples and tools of things you can do to help encourage that, you know, in a work environment at least. But for me, it's a work environment, or it's like the Thanksgiving dinner table with all the extended family around. That's very fertile ground for conflict. You know, you get one person who's watching MSNBC and another person watching Fox News all the time. All you got to do is light a match and boom, you know. But there can sort of be like ground rules. And I don't mean like you show up at the Thanksgiving dinner table and you got to hand out a checklist of ground rules for the that's not going to happen. But
right.
You know, I think in general, if we just approach everyone with just a decent amount of respect for another human being and viewpoints, that right there accomplishes a lot. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I used to travel a lot, so I'd get into cabs or Ubers, sure. And you know, and I would always kind of ask the driver. And I just like talking to people, and sure. I would ask drivers about some political thing to get a sense of where they were on politics.
Right.
And when I said,
you're a brave man, Gabe. You're a brave man, Gabe.
and people say like, well, how do you have political conversations with somebody? It was funny. I was talking to someone who I respect a lot, and I said, you know, there's a great way to manage political conversations with someone who has a completely different viewpoint of yours. He said, yeah, I know what that is. Don't have the conversation. And I said, well,
That's one way.
that's one way. But he said, that's the easiest way. But
Right.
I found that when I would enter conversations with people who were on the opposite side of an issue than I was, my goal was not to try to convince them to persuade them to switch over to my side. That's fantasy. That's delusional. I'd actually be crazy if I could think that I could do that.
That's a great point. That's
But
actually, Gabe, that's actually a really good point because I think a lot of people sort of think that if I throw enough words and throw enough of my viewpoints at you, you're going to say, oh, I'm wrong all this time and let me switch over. That's we don't realistic. That's not realistic.
one of my favorite quotes is, all of your social media posts have really convinced me to drop my viewpoint and join yours. Said no one ever.
That's right.
So, that's the thing. But I like the example of the Uber driver, because when, especially today, much more so than even 5 years ago, when someone knows your viewpoint on this political issue, they're going to automatically assume a whole bunch of other viewpoints that you probably have, and that you're crazy for having all those viewpoints.
Right.
Meanwhile, you haven't even expressed any of those viewpoints. So one goal, I used to have just one goal in these conversations. It's like, I'm going to be talking to this person for 10, 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes. My only goal is to end this conversation where the other person thinks, you know what? That guy was not completely insane. He's not gonna. He seemed like a nice guy. He definitely had a different viewpoint than mine, but he seemed rational in his brain. Like he didn't seem like he should be locked up in a padded room somewhere. And that right there just makes it. I think it gives everybody permission to just express ideas in a respectful way. That someone's not going to agree with.
Right.
To me, that's healthy conflict.
Yeah. So as we talk about being respectful, I think acceptance is part of that. I know we touched on acceptance at the very beginning of this conversation, but acceptance is a big part of that. And when you can accept someone for who they are, the respect just naturally flows.
Yeah, absolutely. And also the acceptance prevents you from getting like triggered. Take a maybe more extreme example, like I know someone who is just a very critical, negative person.
Okay.
Very, very, not, and I don't mind the argumentative part. It's just the negative part. Like, you say something, they're just going to find fault in whatever you say, and they're going to call it out and just use it as an opportunity to just say something. And I realized after years of knowing this person that, she's not actually critical of me. Like, this isn't personal to me. This is just what she does. And she's going to do this to me. She's going to do this to the person behind the counter where she's buying a cup of coffee, and she's going to do it to someone at work. Like, it's just, I'm not special. I'm not up on, I'm no different from everyone else in her life. I'm the same as everybody in her life. So when I used to get triggered with that, like, she'd find fault and I'd just be thinking, I'll get mad. The hair on the back of my neck would stand up saying, I'm being attacked right now. This is personal to me. I got to defend myself and I got to attack right back. But once I got to the point where she was kind of critical of something, I just thought to myself, you know what? This is just her being her. And that's okay. I'm not taking it personally. And then instead of the conversation spiraling into like escalating conflict, we're able to just talk about it. Yeah, I know. I said it wrong. Sometimes, like, if you just kind of fumble your words, you call that out on you. It's like, yes, I did fumble my words. I apologize if that offended you.
Wow.
I said, anyway.
I get it. No, I absolutely get it. And I think we all know people, have met people like that in their lives who who it's almost like that's what they live for, right? So I get it loud and clear. As we talk and we sort of gone back and forth between healthy conflict and then toxic conflict. But it's and Gabe, jump in and correct me if I'm wrong if you think, but in terms of the difference between the two, it's very much seems like there's a fine line between the two. And I mean, I know myself, for example, I've been instances where I'm like, that turned south real quickly. When did that happen? Or how did that happen so quickly? And I kind of sort of feel that the very thin line where you can go from being healthy to toxic if you're not careful.
Yeah. Maybe it helps to talk about what are the toxins.
Okay.
So I've identified, I kind of try to keep it basic, and the toxins are anger, fear, ego, and judgment. And what's interesting about those things is that those are all natural. They naturally occur in human interaction. And within an optimal range, they're actually very healthy. Like there are times when fear is a healthy thing.
Right.
Like if I'm walking down the street at 2 a.m, I stare down a dark alley and think, oh, that's a good shortcut, but it looks dangerous and I'm afraid. Healthy fear. That's going to keep me out of a dangerous situation. If my ego, if I'm at work and someone's taking credit for what I've done, my ego will cause me to speak up and make my contribution known. I think that's healthy. But when any of those things, fear, anger, ego, judgment, when they rise above or fall below that optimal range, it becomes toxic. So, and you were saying, like, sometimes you're having a conversation and like, boom, before you know it, you're in this like toxic thing. What's going on? Well, probably anger and fear and judgment, and ego, they spiked. I've been in conversations with people where maybe they feel that their sense of self is being attacked. Like maybe you're negotiating something. Right. And you're pointing out something that they did and you want to change what they did. And then this like subconscious ego kicks in and was like, well, I did that. So that thing is an extension of me. So if you want to change that, that means you want to change me. Right, and why you want to? And yeah, they don't articulate that thought to themselves consciously, but it's there. So it's understanding like when those things get toxic, and then how to manage it. And that fine line can get crossed pretty quickly.
Yeah. No, it is, and it's interesting because when you talk about the fear, ego, anger, and judgment, it's one we know them all, right? Some of us know them better than others, but we know them, and no one's really surprised to hear that that they can contribute to a toxic conflict. But really, what I'm hearing from you, it's more about how we manage those aspects.
Yes, I found I used to. So I'm a lawyer, the first part of my career, and I'll just share a little kind of thing about ego. I used to be in a company. We represented major brands. These are huge, international companies.
Yep.
And we would get on these conference calls to talk about some things in some of the legal documents. And these are big companies with what I would call steaming piles of bureaucracy. so you got a call with like 10 people on it. And invariably I'd be on the phone, I'd be the legal guy, yep. And there'd be a lawyer on the other side. And then we each would have maybe our marketing people on both sides. And I would have to negotiate some things that in a document. So, and maybe this guy made changes to my document. And I would have to say, well, hey, you made this change, but that actually isn't good for any of us. And this is the reason why. And the problem with that is he can't give in on that point because he's got an audience. Not only is it me, but he's got people he works with that He needs to have their respects to make his job easier. And who wants to acknowledge they made a mistake in front of an audience? And his ego. And so as a result, he'd dig in and he'd say, no, I'm not changing it. Not because he didn't think it was a good change, but because he had to sustain his ego. And one way to manage that, I realized this. Here's a saying, and it's in the book too. Catering to your own ego is very costly, but catering to someone else's ego is free. So when you're dealing with someone whose ego you realize there is driving the conflict, then I say feed that person's ego. Like, it doesn't cost you a penny. And if the person's ego is driving the conflict, recognize that this is a person who, for whatever reason, needs to feel powerful. So tell him he's powerful and respectfully ask him to not use his power to hurt you. You can't be condescending about it, but and what I would do, by the way, I would in advance of one of these calls, I found out the lawyer's number. I called him up. Okay. I said, hey, we got a call coming up. And I just wanted to go over some quick stuff before we get on the big call, just to save some time. And right out of the gate, I'd say, hey, I saw you change this thing that I did. I actually like your change. And in fact, I'm going to steal it and use it moving forward. I hope you don't mind, because that's like, thank you for proving that work.
Right.
Feed the ego. And then now if the person feels better, now I can say, now, by the way, this other change you made, I understand why you made it, but I think it might have some consequences that you haven't thought through. And here's what I'm seeing on my end. And then you can just have a conversation. And so ego, that's a good way to manage ego.
Oh, wow, I like that, because it really, I often hear that saying, it's all about the delivery, right? You can deliver bad news and how you choose to get that across. And I think feeding that ego, acknowledging, the good and the value in someone before you take them down the path where you really want to go. and excuse me. I say that not to make it sound like we're manipulating people, because that's not what it is at all, but we are trying to show the proper respect towards them, but also getting to what we want at the same time. So it's a bit of both what we're playing with, is really what we're doing, right?
Yeah. I mean, the respect piece, I think, is key. And even on a more fundamental level, a lot of not most people, I think everybody wants to feel heard. Absolutely. It's just at a real fundamental level. So if I've got, let's say you and I we have a disagreement.
Yep.
And we need to reach some kind of resolution. You're not going to want to work on a resolution with me until you are convinced that I understand what exactly it is that you want and why you want it. And the reason why you won't want to work on a resolution is like, well, why would I want to work on a resolution when my needs aren't being taken into account? Because that means whatever solution we come up with won't take it into account either.
Right.
So I remember when my kids, I kind of saw this, they were a little younger, but in elementary school, in math, you learn the order of operations, like in a math problem. And by the way, I'm bad at math, so this will not be a good refresher. But
bed math, I used to call it. Bed math, I remember that well.
The order of operations?
The order of operations. Brackets, exponents, division, multiplication, addition, subtraction. There we go. That's all I took from my math.
Yeah. I already forgot about exponents, so you're ahead of me. But the point of that is, if you go out of order, you will get the wrong answer.
Yeah.
So when you're trying to resolve a conflict with somebody, the order of operations is the first thing you must do is understand their position.
Yes.
And the second thing you must do is articulate their position back to them so they know that you understand it.
Yes.
If you try to jump to the resolution before you do one of those things, you're going out of the order of operations and you'll get the wrong answer. And I like to, the goal I always have is I want to repeat someone's position back to them better than they even said it themselves.
Wow.
Because if I can do that, just think of like the times where you're talking to someone and you have a thought and you're kind of bumbling through some words and it's not coming out right. But then all of a sudden the other person says, "Oh, do you mean this?" And then you're like, "Yes, that is exactly what I mean." That moment, it's like, "Oh, okay, this person gets me. All right."
Yes.
Yes. If you could create that moment in a conversation, then you're going to be able to resolve whatever conflict you have.
Yep. And a big part of that is listening, Gabe. I mean, if you're not hearing people, like really hearing them for what they're saying, but also hearing their feelings too, because I think that's part of that. If you can connect with individual on an emotional level and hear the way they feel and can articulate that, I think that's getting you closer to where you're describing, right? The place you want to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's something called confirmation bias that really gets in the way of listening.
Yeah.
You know, I think Warren Buffett's quote is something like, one thing that humans are like great at is filtering all new information in a way that will only support their pre-existing belief. Meaning, if they hear new information that contradicts something that they believe, then they will discard. They won't pay attention to that information.
Yes.
And when you have that, it's really hard to actually just hear what someone else is saying.
Yes.
Yeah. And there are things you can do to overcome it. There's some tools that are easy to use, and you just got to work on it. But it takes work. It does take work.
It does. You know, Gabe, you talked a little bit about your legal background, and really what I find really interesting, it fits nicely in the scope of conflict, right? Because conflict and lawyers, that's what they're supposed to do, right? And battle and disagree. The idea of a healthy conflict. Do you see a place for that in the legal practice, or do you see how it fits, or is it just conflict, and that's the way it is?
Yeah, no, absolutely. The only way any conflict, even a lawsuit, gets resolved is when you can have a healthy dialogue. I think the issue with lawsuits is that things have already gone pretty bad to cause someone to go to court and file a lawsuit. Mm-hmm. And by the way, one of the areas of practice that I did was legal malpractice.
Okay.
So one of my partners was big in meaning we represented people suing other lawyers for screwing up. Mm. So if you think about a lawsuit as being contentious, this was like on steroids, And it's great training. Like, imagine cross-examining someone who cross-examines people for a living and who just freaking hates you. You learn a lot about conflict and how that energy of conflict flows. And I would say that the best way for lawsuits to resolve is when you got two people or two parties, whatever it is, that clearly have very different opinions as to how things should resolve. And they're going to war. So now you're in like wartime conditions. People are going to have to back off of their positions. But probably only after they fight for a little bit. Right. Very few lawsuits get filed and then settle immediately. Usually there's some fighting first. Right. But when you get to the point where you've been fighting for a while and both sides have their armaments all built up with all their weapons pointed at each other, and it's like, look, if each of us pushes this button in front of us, then we're going to unleash all our weaponry on each other. Right. Now that we can see that, that's one way to resolve this. But that means one of us is going to die, maybe both of us. I mean, not literally, but in the lawsuit. No, absolutely. Yeah. And then you can say, okay, now that we've come face to face with what that outcome could possibly be, let's talk about some other options. And that creates the room and the space to say, well, I really don't like what you've done. I don't even like you, but I want to resolve this. Here are some options, So, and that is healthy. That right there is a very healthy conflict. But it had to be unhealthy first. Right.
When did you come to that realization to actually make the distinction between the two? Were you already kind of into your career at that point, or was something you knew beforehand? When did you sort of that awakening? Because I would imagine that there's still a lot who feel that there's only one way of doing this, and it's a unhealthy way.
Right. It was sort of like, it was a sequence of events. I remember having the thought a number of times as a lawyer, looking at a case and, like doing the research and everything and realizing, being able to identify the moment in time when the conflict went really bad. I'm looking back at like maybe a letter one party sent to the other, and it's like, wow, I wouldn't have sent that letter. I would have picked up, and like God, if they hadn't sent that letter, we wouldn't even be here right now. So learning that, and then when I realized that when we engaged in healthier conflict, my clients and I had a much better experience with the legal system. And when it was toxic, it was usually much more expensive for the client and stressful. And then I left the practice of law and got into just business. And it was a whole different set of issues we were dealing with, but I immediately had like pattern recognition. Like anytime something would happen, it's like, well, wait, I've seen this pattern before. I've seen this pattern 100 times before. And then thinking like, wow, it isn't just lawsuits. This is just human interaction that happens anytime people have to work together. So being in two very different environments, yet seeing the same patterns of conflict was when I started to think, okay, the commonality here it's human beings. If you pull human beings out of the situation, you don't really have conflict.
No conflict. All is good.
Yeah, no conflict. If it's a bunch of robots working together, there's no conflict.
I love it. But very true. I can't take that point from you, Gabe. Listen, this has been such an awesome chat. I really do appreciate you being here and providing a perspective, a very enlightening perspective on conflict, because it affects all of us. And, I think we've all been in it at some point or another. So to be able to view it from a different lens, I think is important. And to be able to develop some of these skills, which you outline in your book. Let's hold that book up again there for them, Gabe. Don't get mad at the penguins and other ways to detox conflict from your life and business. I get it all?
Yeah, you got it all. Available anywhere books are sold. And there's an audio book too. So if you're into audio, you got Audible or audiobooks.com or wherever else.
There we go. And if individuals wanted to catch up with you, Gabe, where could we send them?
GabeKarp.com. So just my name, Gabe Karp, all one word, and .com.
There we go. Well, listen, Gabe, again, this has been awesome. Thanks for the time. Congrats on the book. And I appreciate, again, the insights on conflict and all the good things that we can do to get past it and be in that healthy place as opposed to the toxic one. So thanks again.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me. It's been fun.
Awesome.
Appreciate it.
Be well. Take care. Yeah. Thank you.
All right,
appreciate it. Back we are on the podcast, and it was very, very cool to chat with Gabe about positive, healthy, non-toxic conflict and really how achievable it is for all of us. And I know, listen, it's not always a comfortable space to be in, but if we can control our emotions and do things like exhibiting empathy, exercising patience, and practicing understanding and acceptance, we really can make things go a far, far way. On the topic of acceptance and understanding, I'd encourage you to pick up a copy of his book, Don't Get Mad at Penguins, and Other Ways to Detox the Conflict in Your Life and Business. Again, it doesn't make sense to be angry with penguins because they can't fly. We just have to accept that as a fact and move on. So again, thanks, Gabe. Really appreciate you for being here. So awesome, and wish you continued success. When I reflect on my conversation with Gabe, he really left us with a lot of great points. But if there's just one thing that I take from our chat, it would be this. Despite the fact that penguins are birds with wings and feathers, they can't fly like other birds. This is a commonly accepted fact that nobody gets mad about. So, bearing that in mind, you can start to see how we can significantly reduce conflict and strife in our lives by simply accepting people as they are in the same fashion that we accept penguins not being able to take flight. When we stop expecting others to miraculously change into something they're not overnight, we can save ourselves so much unnecessary frustration. Acceptance is the ability to see that others have a right to be their own unique persons. That means having a right to their own feelings, thoughts, and opinions. When you accept people for who they are, you let go of your desire to change their viewpoints and thoughts, which will naturally make way for positive, non-toxic, audacious conflict. Hey, listen, if you haven't registered for email notifications of the podcast, please know that you can do so simply by heading over to bestaudaciouslife.com, and all you've got to do is enter in your email address and you'll be alerted every time we've got brand new content that comes out. We, of course, reached the end of another episode of the podcast, and as always, I send my thanks and appreciation to our audacious listeners. Appreciate your support so much, and thank you for being with us on this journey. Until next time, stay safe, be kind, show love to one another, and be audacious.
You've been listening to the Audacious Living Podcast, hosted by Audacious Stevenson. If you enjoyed what you heard, be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Until next time, be audacious.